For those looking for a liberatory martial arts learning approach and curriculum, we've created Liberation Martial Arts. It doesn't just teach you martial arts, it's also an approach to learning movement skills. The whole point of our program is to remove the need for a coach, to liberate you from the need of top-down instruction and toxic gyms. If you have a coach and also have a gym, then you can apply our learning approach to improve your progress. Or maybe you also need a supplemental martial arts community as a counter to the commercial gym you go to. You can actually apply our learning approach to learn anything, and our practitioners are. They're applying it to all sorts of things, whether physical, mental, or even personal. It's just a radically different approach to everything. Sign up for Liberation Martial Arts at the Southpaw Pod Patreon, or support us by signing up for one of the other tiers and help us support this project while also getting access to bonus content like early releases of SDS9 with transcripts. SDS9 Season 3 was recorded from the beginning of 2023 to early 2024 and was first published on Patreon. Now that we're done with the season, the entire season is being released all at once on the Southpaw public feed. Find Season 4 on the Southpaw Pod Patreon. This is Southpaw Deep Space Nine Season 3, where we analyze Deep Space Nine and Star Trek from a political and historical lens episode by episode. I'm watching DS9 with fresh eyes, and Scott is our veteran Trek fan. We are discussing Season 3 of DS9, Episode 11, Past Tense, Part 1. And to help us talk about this two-parter is Lake from the Revolutionaries Garden. Welcome, Lake.
Hey, glad to be here.
So can you begin by telling us what is the Revolutionaries Garden?
So it started off as just a Facebook page, but then I got on the podcast train. So now it is a sort of, I call it an audio toolbox of how-tos in regards to food security and general preparedness, but from a leftist and community-based focused instead of this weird hyper self-sufficient focus that a lot of food projects orient around. And and we have a communal farm on the coast of Maine where we, raise goats and plant food and do the communism.
The communism as explained in The Last of Us.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, your social media account has quite a bit of followers. Were you surprised that people were so interested in gardening and farming from a leftist Marxist perspective?
I mean, at first I was very surprised and it kind of took off faster than I expected. But then the pandemic hit, and that's kind of when the viewership skyrocketed. I think about a year in the pandemic, I hit about 100,000 followers. And a lot of people, it was just the pandemic days of everyone wanted to garden, everyone wanted to kind of do the stuff for themselves. And for the first time, they actually had a moment of time to do it.
Do you think part of it is also like people who follow your page aren't even interested in these topics per se? It's more of like a break from doom scrolling or like technology, or all like the bad news is kind of like a little place to just calm down or slow down and just read some posts or look at some posts about nature.
I hope so, because I kind of have a little checklist of things I have to cross off before I make a post. And I try to not be too negative or not constantly report on negative current news, just because there are plenty of pages that already do that. And that's handled. And I definitely try to consciously make it a more low key, supportive, nice place. And I'll even jump in the comments if someone's arguing or or if there's dog piling, which there's a lot of, and just say, hey guys, let's simmer down. Let's go back to having a conversation. I'm also very liberal with the ban hammer. If someone's just being rude, I will block or ban them without a second's hesitation.
Now, how did you get into Trek and sci-fi?
I grew up with it a little bit. I feel like just having a slightly left-leaning family, you end up watching Star Trek because it was the only remotely leftist television on in the 90s and 2000s. But weirdly enough, my first Trek was Enterprise, which is the weirdest and kind of the most reactionary post 9/11 stuff, Star Trek. But I got back into it in high school and college, and I've binged all of Star Trek at this point, and DS9 isn't my personal favorite, but I think it's the best Star Trek.
So how do you use a Marxist lens when it comes to gardening and farming?
So, I mean, partially it's just keeping in mind the goals of Marxism, which is, building alternative power structures, building revolutionary potential in yourself and your community and in a broader, community. But also, weirdly enough, I find myself applying dialectical materialism to the garden a lot, which has kind of developed over time the more I've learned about it and the more I've studied theory and the more I've gardened. But I'll find myself framing decisions I have to make or processes I have to pursue in the garden through dialectics, because there's so much in the garden that's contradictory. Like, oh, you need to bring in organic material to make your garden healthier. But if you bring in too much, you bring in pests and diseases. And by using dialectics, you can kind of you can resolve that contradiction based on your circumstances. If you have a big healthy garden, bring in all you want, and you'll be able to ride it out. But if you have a small delicate garden, minimize how much you bring in to try to minimize that impact. And it's been an interesting process exploring that as the years have gone by.
And it's less known, but Marx did write a lot about nature and earth matter and even early concepts of climate change, like metabolic rift, where he talked about, like taking things out from the earth, extracting, it's going to go somewhere and it's going to cause problems.
And even with Marx, people will quote him as saying labor is the source of all value, but he actually said labor and natural resources are the source of all value. Like, he recognized the importance of just the stuff around us and as part of a materialist perspective.
Yeah, looking at the material around us, you would think, wouldn't be that odd for a materialist.
Yeah. Imagine that.
Since you're always looking at the soil and the weather, what are your thoughts as far as pollution and climate change in the future?
I mean, I'll try not to get too bleak. It's rough. I work at a dairy farm and we have to cut our own hay to get us through the winter. And this dairy farm is 75 years old. And for the first 65 years, they only had one summer of drought. And in the past 10 years, we've had 7 droughts over the summer that have seriously impacted hay harvest. And this year, we irrigated, we expanded pasture, we did all of these crazy over the top things. And even then, we barely got enough hay to make us through the winter. And these conditions are just going to keep getting worse. And I'm not saying there's no way to fix it. There is, but any kind of gardening, any kind of resource planning, you just have to take that into account now that the climate is messed up and it's going to get more messed up. And we got to be able to bunker down and get through that in productive ways.
This is good because a lot of times when we talk about pollution and climate crisis, we look at things from a statistical or macro level, but you're giving us a real on the ground, one specific instance of how this is affecting a 75-year-old farm. So I think that makes it easier for people to comprehend and understand.
Yeah. And I know I mostly touched on climate change, but even in regards to pollution, I don't know if you guys heard of PFAS, they're the forever chemicals. Maine farms have been hit particularly hard where there are entire hay fields we can't hay now because they're so polluted with PFAS that they would transfer into the milk of the cows and we couldn't even sell it. So it's just all of these things are sort of stacking on one another. And there's good research on how to how to remove PFAS from soil, but it's just coming along so slowly, and it's hard to be able to afford to do those sorts of things. And it's, the solutions to that stuff is big, and we need to, we have to come up with big solutions for big problems.
So this is a great segue into talking about how our past actions build today and the future. Scott, tell us about past tense, part 1.
Well, so in the past, there were tense. No, I'm sorry.
You always say you don't like puns, yet you keep doing puns.
Oh, it's complicated. So Ben is going to Portland with the team on the Defiant, like the A team, because they're going to a symposium to talk about what is going on with the Gamma Quadrant and the Dominion and all of that. And also his sister is in Portland, so he's going to see her. They receive a message from Quark, who asks that the Grand Negus be brought up because they've been helping each other out and just like clear up some things for him and just like do some political tete-a-tete.
Did they ever clarify if they're talking about Portland, Maine or Portland, Oregon?
I believe it's Portland. Because they're on the West Coast in the episode, my assumption is Portland, Oregon.
I got to assume they're talking about Oregon because no one talks about Portland, Maine.
The person from Maine is no selling Maine.
There's nothing out here, guys. Just stay away. There's nothing here. Don't bother.
I know Stephen King really likes Maine, but, I don't know. Most people that talk about Portland are talking about Portland, Maine. Yes, some people that are talking about Paris are talking about Texas, but,
comparing Portland, Maine to Paris, Texas.
Honestly, I think Paris, Texas has more people.
I'm a Wim Wenders fan, so that's where I'm coming from on this. So Quark is talking to Cisco. They're sort of building a rapport. They're both quoting from the rules of acquisition. Cisco's been learning it, and they're going to do some political favors for the Grand Negus because they've been helping them out in the Gamma Quadrant because the Ferengi have lines in the Gamma Quadrant. And as we know, consumerism is important in war. I mean, there's no war yet. There could never be a war there, but things certainly aren't looking good. So Cisco, Dax, and Bashir are going to go to the transport, and O'Brien wishes them well, and Kira's going to stay on the Defiant as the ranking officer because she's ranking officer of the team, even though she's not technically Starfleet. And then Miles notices that there's like sort of a fluctuation in the transporter beam, science. And the team does not materialize they don't materialize. But then they materialize somewhere else. They are asked for their IDs. They are in 2024 in a sanctuary district. Cisco notices the guns and the language and the things they use, and he knows where and when they are. But they are picked up. Cisco and Bashir are picked up, and Dax is knocked out on the subway. She is awakened and is asked by a man if she was robbed. She just sort of goes with all the questions. She sort of leads. She's offered to go with this guy, Chris Bruner, who we're going to learn is a pretty important cat, to try to get her ID back. And this sort of sets up a pretty interesting duality of the episode. Miles and Kira know that Cisco, Dax, and Bashir did beam, but they can tell that they did beam somewhere, but they don't know where or when. And then they see that when the transportation happened, the beam was a hiccup. So there was a hiccup in the science, so that could be the culprit. Back in 2024, they are in San Francisco. Cisco lets them know that they are really a century away from the world that most people know of Earth in the Federation. They are in a sanctuary district, a two-zone section city, basically a city because it's walled in, for the homeless, poor, undocumented people that don't want to work. There's the gimmies who want to work, and the dims who are sick, and the ghosts who just sort of are the ne'er-do-wells or something. And there's processing centers and police, even though they're not called police, but they're police. It's 21st century America. And, you know, am I talking about 21st century America in the show, or 21st century America right now in the gaping hellhole very close to 2024 right now? I'm sure we won't discuss that later. Anyway, so in this America, there are sanctuary cities all over America. This is their way of dealing with this. At Chris's, Jadzia is able to get the ideas she needed because she uses culture cues to answer questions, and Chris thinks that her dots are tattoos, but he's like, I used to have tattoos, I used to be a punk, but I sold out, and now I'm chilling here. And you could just see the difference between the rich and the poor in this culture. And Chris basically runs a news and cable corporation. And we go back to the processing centers. The computers do not recognize who Ben and Bashir are. They have to fill out lots of forms. And that's when Miles realizes that the energy in the system redirected the beam. They did go to San Francisco, but they went to the San Francisco in the past. Oops. But they're also not sure where in the past they were. They are. Back in 2024, Ben is pensive and looks very upset and thoughtful. And Bashir is just angry because he just sees the inequity and how poorly people are being treated, and is like, some of the people are not being treated for things that medicine of this time can fix. And we find out it is August 30th, 2024. The Bell Riots, one of the most significant violent civil uprisings in the American history, which is not necessarily the language I would use, happened in September 2024 in the exact district that they are in. If they don't get out, Ish is going to get action-packed. Starfleet displacement policy states that they cannot interfere, but this event will change the course of the United States and eventually get to fixing societal problems. They cannot change this because the Gabriel Bell, the man for whom the riots are named, the government breaks into the district to find supposedly dead hostages, all alive due to Bell, who sacrificed his own life to save them. So this is all about to happen. They can't stop this. Ben and Bashir are given info and supplies and to wait, and they're to leave the sanctuary. They can't leave the sanctuary yet, but they are gimmies, and they just see that the people here just need a lot of social, civil, and medical support, and the government either is not equipped to treat them, or they're choosing not to, because when you balance out the scenes with Dax, there is quite the difference between the haves and the have-nots, and the division is something terrible. They are told to watch out for security as well, as because the security cops, they're overworked, understaffed, underpaid, and scared. Chris is looking for Dax's friend and lets him just stay at a nice hotel. Dax is looking and sees that in the districts, these cities, there's terrible inequity, and just there are all these social problems that are the real sickness. And Bashir posits, are humans any different than Cardassians or Romulans? No. Bashir asks. They have trouble finding a place to sleep. There's unrest even between the people in these sanctuaries. On the Defiant, Miles, Odo, and Kira believe that they can beam into the past. They just need zany volunteers. and they just know who the zany volunteers will be. It's going to be Miles and Kira.
Miles just wanted to go back in time to see the Irish reunification of 2024.
I mean, if there was, I think Miles would be a tanky. I don't know. The next morning, Sisko and Bashir are trying to escape the tenement cities. The team wants to get to the roof to try to escape. Bashir and Sisko make a deal with some gentlemen to get access and are now in civilian clothes. They see families who can't take care of their own. Bashir helps a kid with broken ribs. The family he helps implores them to help, that everyone needs together. We need to get together. We need to show the world what is happening. We need solidarity amongst the workers. The neo-Trotskyists are the bad guys here, according to the rich people, but that's more like in Europe. Whatever. Amongst the rich, Jadzia finds out more about the Sanctuary District, and she's promised that she can look into it and see if Sisko and Bashir are there. Bashir and Sisko get into a fight in the Sanctuary District. They're saved, but in all of that, someone dies. But you know who died? You know the person who died? Gabriel Bell. Oops. Oops. Without Gabriel Bell, there is no riot. They're going to have to save the hostages. Sisko and Bashir are going to have to help everyone, start to spread the word, look presentable. Dax wonders why there is a wall around these cities if they are so safe. But she's found Sisko and Dax, and back to Kira and them. Starfleet doesn't want them to go back in time, but they're going to go anyway. It's getting worse and worse and worse in the district. Violence, unrest, hostages are being taken. And now Sisko is going by Gabriel Bell.
A note to our listeners. If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, like early releases of Southpaw Deep Space Nine, our fictional narrative podcast, Fighters Brew, break-free versions of our shows without interruptions like you're hearing now, bonus articles, Fighters Brew transcripts with extra content, Liberation Martial Arts Online, as well as our private chat group on Discord. You can also make one-time donations at Ko-Fi or show your solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com. You know, with all the problems Trek characters have with the transporter throughout all the franchises, maybe this isn't such a cool technology that many fans think it is. Secondly, from a story perspective, the thing I don't like about time travel stories is once you introduce it, it makes everything seem inconsequential because you can always time travel to fix it, which brings me to how the Marvel Universe wrote itself into a corner because there are no stakes. Nothing matters. Because not only can they go back in time, but to different universes, and also they exist in a shared universe where there's always someone who can rescue you. So time travel stories can tell interesting stories, but it's always like it was all a dream episode because everything gets put back into place. But also introducing time travel introduces that ability into the canon, which affects all future stories. And I know DS9 wasn't the first one to introduce time travel. I know it's existed before. But Lake, how do you feel about time travel episodes and the transporter as a plot device?
I mean, the transporter is just funny because it's so, like, we see so much dangerous stuff happening with the transporter all the time. But I feel like they kind of talk about that in Lower Decks, how it's just like what we're seeing is all the sensational stuff, and there's all sorts of normal stuff happening in the background. You know, it's kind of like you could say cars are obscene, like cars are actually obscenely dangerous, but because you don't get into a car accident every day, you don't really think about it. But so I don't know, maybe it's just the statistics of transporters makes it acceptable. As for time travel, so I've never been a fan of time travel episodes for a lot of the same reasons you were talking about. They just, for one, you have to clarify what kind of time travel world you're talking about where you can go back and change things, or, oh, when you go back and change things, that's because it already happened and it actually causes what happened in the future. And it's sort of like a non-story. But I will say we mentioned Enterprise earlier, and I will say in Enterprise, they actually do talk a bit about the complications of time travel in the Trek universe, and they talk about these temporal wars between different factions. And I think that was them trying to remedy, all of these plot holes left behind by time travel stories, and trying to say, oh, okay, people don't actually proactively time travel, because if you do it, it's like a Cold War thing. Like if you do it, then the other guy will start doing it, and you're both are just going to wipe out all life in the universe on accident.
Okay, to go back to Marvel, I think that's where they're at also with these multiverse time travel stories too.
Yeah. And I'm not saying it's a particularly satisfactory way to solve that, but it's something cold, like just introducing it's like nuclear weapons in the Cold War. Yeah, it's extremely powerful, but no one would dare use it.
Scott, what do you think about transporter episodes? And this is a double whammy, right? It's a transporter / time travel episode.
Well, so I hate transporter episodes because the concept of transporters and what you got in my head about what transporting probably means, in that you die every time that you transport, really upsets me. So whenever I'm forced to think about transporting or transporters, I get a little bit of an anxiety attack. So it's not really my favorite. But I always think of things like everything is a plot device. So even in the way I've been doing recaps lately, sometimes I'll be like, the science does science stuff, because I don't know. I'm not a very adept scientist by any means, not even a social scientist. I mean, I'm a social worker, but I don't know. So when they say this thing is doing this thing, I just assume so. So I thought it was a very interesting way to turn it into a time travel episode, because usually time travel is in Star Trek done deliberately, mostly. So that's how I feel. And as far as time travel, I'm of two thoughts. I could just say time travel in Trek, in which it's sometimes I like it and sometimes I don't. I think this episode did it really well. I think season 2 of Picard was pretty corny. I thought Star Trek 4 was fun. First Contact, the Star Trek film, is one of my favorite Star Trek movies. So I'm not really into when you take away the stakes of something. So yeah, time travel as a plot device frustrates me. And yeah, if nothing matters, it's just harder to care.
So to add another conundrum to the transporter problem, in this episode, we find out that they were transported to an unknown location, right? So if a transporter can transport you anywhere and you don't even know where they were sent, it means you can also be transported into a wall or a building and just die. This isn't to nitpick the show. This is more for people who fantasize about having transporters in real life. Like, no, there's a lot wrong with it also. There's no free lunch. I think Marx said that.
No, I think that was Lenin.
Oh, okay. And then Scott also mentioned some of the previous things we mentioned about as far as transporter problems and also the ethical problems, right? About transparency. They don't tell you any of this before you get on or on the show. And they probably don't want to, because now we're getting really into the weeds. But if we are thinking about philosophy and doing a breakdown, then we should discuss this. Now, Dax was the first person to realize something was up and to play along. She transitioned into an unknown situation really smoothly. What does this tell us about Dax?
So I just want to say I took notes for this episode, and I feel like every note on a Dax scene was just, Dax just getting along fine. She's doing great right here.
Or is this bad writing? Like they just needed her to know how to do everything.
Yeah. But yeah, Dr. Twink and Captain Dad are just getting bullied around the gutter by Fash cops, but Dax is just whining and dining and having a lovely time.
Yo, did you just call Dr. Bashir Dr. Twink?
Yeah, Captain Dad and Dr. Twink.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, I think what happened was they wanted to have the rich versus poor angle going on here, and that's basically why Dax was along for the ride. And they were just using her as they just wanted to insert her into this situation where she was showing you how the rich people were living, just a few blocks away from the sanctuary.
Because she was almost written like a Mary Sue or My Girl Friday kind of character where she just knew everything.
Yeah. And I think it's a little lazy just to get this plot device moving, but I don't think it's inconsistent with her character. We see her playing games with the Ferengi and singing Klingon opera and just sort of, because of all of this wisdom she has as this ageless godworm, she just can float effortlessly between any situation and any culture and just have it under control.
If anyone is going to be able to get into any situation and code switch and be able to convince people that they belong, is somebody who is a ever living godworm person, as you said. you're just throwing out some winners. So Dax has lived several lives, and so it makes sense that they would know how to code switch and just be all right wherever they go. Fit in with the poor, fit in with the rich, fit in anywhere.
Yeah, I feel like in using her in this kind of plot device way, it also says something about her character, that if she has lived so many lifetimes, then she has all these skills that the writers have yet to introduce us to that we can look forward to, right? And now she's been around San Francisco in 2024, which is a year from now, from where we are and when we are recording. And just to give some context, DS9 was airing a couple of years after the Los Angeles uprising. There were also the San Francisco and Northridge earthquakes with loss of displacement and environmental racism. But the inspiration for the actual story was from the 1971 Attica prison uprising. I don't think the writers could say it was also inspired by the LA uprising because it would have made so many viewers and critics mad. But because of the timing, that's what people think of. And you look at the police in this episode, that's probably what also people thought of, because what sparked the LA uprising was the brutality by the LA Police Department against Rodney King.
But, and I mean, there are countless, semi-modern historical examples that I think they were consciously or subconsciously drawing on. Like the one that came to mind for me was the Watts Rebellion. But, you could pull out open up a history book, turn a couple of pages and find this kind of civil unrest that they could have been drawing on just again and again and again.
So even if it's not what the writers were thinking of, we as people who know history can also project some of what we know onto this, because this is just like simulating things that have already happened. But according to Ira Bear, the other inspiration was him living in Los Angeles. And to place this, he lived there right after Reagan got rid of all the mental health facilities, which started the LA unhoused crisis in earnest. And looking at the unhoused situation, Bear was like, what's the end game to all this? And he said people would probably decide to put them in concentration camps, which reminds me a lot of favelas when they're talking about the walls. And how safe is it, right? When you have all those walls and the favelas and who's being protected from who and what is happening here, which actually nearly happened while this was filming, because the LA mayor at the time, Richard Riordan, literally wanted to put the unhoused in concentration camps to clean up downtown. But rather than calling it sanctuary districts, they were calling it haven districts. So Bear was right about where LA was headed and still headed. Now, if you live in Los Angeles, you know that's exactly what LA homeowning liberals are tacitly demanding. Or they're just tacitly demanding or outright demanding social cleansing programs where the unhoused are genocided. You know the meme about never asking a LA liberal about the unhoused? That's real, especially the real estate obsessed homeowners. They're LA's Nazis. But the thing about LA fascist homeowners or the Attica prison uprising or the LA uprising was that race and racism were huge components and are huge components. Whereas here, race is only very subtly examined. Here, the oppressors and the oppressed are racially diverse. So they really didn't want to make race an explicit component. It was almost a Pollyanna dystopia in that way. They're fascist, but not racist. How is it fascism, though, if racialized people have equal opportunity to be wealthy elites? See how dystopian logic falls apart when you don't fully address race? Like, what are your thoughts about how it portrayed oppression and how it did or didn't address race as a component?
I mean, I feel like they very consciously made Gabriel Bell a black man, but then they also made sure that the rich people you saw with Dax were, oh, that's not this episode. Never mind. But yeah, like they showed that black people working in the correctional system and trying to, be administrators. And I think that was very conscious, because there were probably some politics going on there that they couldn't really get into. As far as, just it struck me, in that opening scene in 2024 San Francisco, that the cops were interacting with what they thought were homeless people, guns out, calling them slurs, calling this guy who was trying to go easy on them an anarchist. All that, struck me really presently. And I think, yeah, they are trying to build sanctuary districts. I feel like every other year I see some article about a camp being built well outside the city that they can just shove all the homeless people into. I lived on the east side of Seattle for a while, and they had a zero tolerance homelessness policy. So if you were sleeping on the street, you would get kicked out immediately, and basically you would just have to go back to downtown Seattle. It was the only place that homeless folks weren't immediately kicked out of. And in some ways, we already have sanctuary districts. The largest mental health care provider in the state of California is the California State Prison System. And it's by a wide margin. But the problem with that is that it's expensive to imprison and hold homeless people. It's cost somewhere upwards of $50,000 a year per person. So whether they're mentally ill or homeless or committed a crime, doesn't matter. It's too expensive to try to keep them in prison. So yeah, the idea of these districts where they can just shunt them off to the side is probably pretty appealing to, California liberals.
Yeah, no, like, what is that? What was that movie, Brick Mansions, or District B19? This shit will happen.
Yeah. And I mean, even just, this footage of the sanctuary district, it looked, and the worst part is it looked better than some of the informal homeless camps in Seattle, because they had buildings to use at least. They weren't just shunted under, on-ramps of interstates and into these dark corners. Like, that's the worst part. This is the dystopia, and it almost looks better than the current situation.
I think they purposefully tried to make it like, well, in Star Trek, the issues are about other things, not race. At least in this episode, because there are episodes that, there are episodes in the future that do talk about race in the American paradigm, but not so much in this one. I thought they were purposefully diverse.
Yeah, Star Trek can talk about race as long as they're not talking about racism between humans. It has to be racism among aliens, then they can talk about it.
Bear said this episode was also supposed to examine race, actually. But obviously, it didn't do it enough. And the examination is all implied. Like you mentioned, like how Dax is treated compared to Cisco and Bashir. But that also has to do with who found them first, a civilian versus cops. And also, it read as having to do more with Dax being a beautiful woman than about her race. So if they were so subtle about it, it might not even be there.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely wrote that Dax being like, they always talk about how beautiful Dax is. And I'm sure that there was that implied angle, especially because this was the 90s. And yeah, I feel like all of the commentaries about race were so subtle. Like Cisco being referred to as boy a lot. That particularly struck me.
New boy.
Yeah, exactly. But even that was kind of just stuck in there.
Now, if we are going to go with Bear's take that there was examination of race, we have to talk about intersecting identities and race, which we've discussed before. Dax is literally a non-binary alien of literal two spirits, but she's also white. So she still has white privilege, even as an alien. A white alien is being treated better than black and brown humans. I've mentioned how a lot of the aliens are white. And yes, they made the commander black and the doctor brown, but most everyone else is white, including the aliens. And with that comes privilege. And there's white privilege to get cast as the aliens as well. So it is in the show, but it's also in the making of the show. Now, do you two think fans understood at the time that an alien could still have white privilege, or even understood that this is what the writers were trying to convey?
No. No. Most people weren't even really talking about, like, white privilege as a concept is very, very rudimentary for, at least in my life and even in culture in the 90s. I think that wasn't something you were getting in Hollywood.
I mean, I'm inclined to agree. I don't necessarily have evidence to the contrary, but I think the biggest takeaway people would have taken is, oh, Dax pretty, so she do fine.
And also, Ira Bear's statements might have been made much later. So he could have been taking today's knowledge and projecting it onto his own work of the past. Now with Cisco and Bashir, if you're trying to say black and brown people get oppressed, why did you make the sanctuary so white? It betrays the message you're trying to convey. Though the other subtle racism that you mentioned, Lake, was the use of new boys, which, like you said, could be read as the racialized term boy, which has a long history that y'all can look up. But there are a lot of slurs in this episode, but none of them seem to be used racially. They're more ableist. But the term gimmies reminds me of Reagan, which this whole episode had Reagan, Bush, and Clinton prison and tough on urban communities vibes throughout. Gimme meaning gimme stuff, gimme work, gimme money. Similar to Reagan's term, quote unquote, welfare queen, which was racialized, but the writers here didn't try to convey that. What did you two think about all the casual use of derogatory terms in this episode and how normalized it was?
I mean, I was definitely, again, I've watched these shows. I've watched Deep Space Nine many times, but this rewatch is very special because I'm doing it along with the show, and I'm watching it with notes, and I'm watching it with my books and my articles around me. So I'm taking it more seriously, and I'm really doing an academic reviewing of applying a lens to it. So I was definitely looking at the language of gimmies and the dims and all the other things. And I was like, I don't like this at all. And I'll have some more thoughts about it because it is a two-parter, so.
And I think the show was being critical of those terms as well, or at least examining them and how we use them and how we currently probably have substitute terms like that already in use at the time of the episode.
Yeah, I definitely think it was very purposeful. And I kind of appreciated how even the well-meaning social worker resorted to using them, even though she's the good guy in this situation, and how she even fell on those, framing of the situation. But I think it mirrors a lot of how people look at the homeless and anybody who's struggling. There's this idea of the good homeless person who's working they're working hard, they're pounding the pavement, they're trying to do the right thing and get back on their feet, as opposed to, the people who are too unwell to even bother, or the thugs, the ghosts that they referred to, these violent criminal element who is just the worst of the worst. And you kept seeing that dichotomy reinforced throughout the episode of, the good homeless people versus the bad homeless people.
Then there's talk about Maori tattoos in Japan, which can be read as cultural appropriation and white weeb culture. How did you two read that scene?
I read it just like that. Like, this dude's like a corny weeb, dude who probably owns some culturally questionable artifacts and is like, I'm a cool capitalist because I have thumb rings and I know things and
I do yoga.
That was the vibe I got.
Yeah. I mean, in the episode, knockoff David Bowie there didn't even do anything particularly bad, but he just rubbed me the wrong way the entire time because of exactly what you're talking about. I'm like, I know that guy. I've met that guy and he is insufferable.
Yes. That's definitely a type that still exists. What did you two think about Michael Webb, who's all about organizing? Literally even said, we need to organize. How should we read him? Is he the Lenin of this episode?
I mean, that would be a strong title to give this guy. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, there was nothing wrong with what he was talking about, organizing, working together, cooperating. But it was very much this liberal plea to the powers that be, this idea of like, if we just ask them nice enough, or if we make them aware of what's happening, then they'll come and fix things out of the goodness of their hearts. And it just struck me as a lot of the way a lot of liberal organizers strike me, which is just if we ask nice enough, we'll get the thing. It's only because of ignorance, or only because they don't quite know that they're letting this stuff happen. If we just let people know, it'll get fixed, because the system is ultimately correct. This is just a slight deviation.
But I did think that he was an interesting character who I think we could give a little more props to, because I think of the people in the time he was really trying to do something, and I didn't look at it from a particularly liberal lens. I saw him from a more collectivist stance.
Now, this episode has Bashir and Cisco talking about the American past, which liberal fans of DS9 seem to love. They seem to love that scene. But it does have a lot of Make America Great Again vibes, because they keep referring to a mythic past where Americans didn't used to be like this, and that they just need to remember again. But it seems like American exceptionalism, which is historically inaccurate. Cisco says they were like this for 100 years, but weren't like this prior. But the prior period was apartheid and enslavement. Did this conversation stand out to you too?
Yeah, I mean, there was even this one quote from, Bashir there, where he said, this is just causing people to suffer because they've forgotten how to care. And
forgotten.
Yeah, exactly. Like, he was applying, they just forgot, or like there's just not enough compassion.
No racism.
Yeah. It was just this complete disregard for systemic problems, and just they just don't care enough. They've forgotten. They just need to remember how to care about other humans, and then it'll be good,
It was on accident. It just slipped their mind.
Yeah. Oh, and you mentioned earlier, like Bashir fearing the Federation becoming reactionary under pressure or threat, like the way Cardassians or Romulans are. That stuck with me a lot. I think it's a little bit. I think there's some foreshadowing there. I don't want to get too spoily, but just this recognition that under enough pressure, people can turn to reaction as a solution.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like, because I threw in an aside about it in the play-by-play. That was how I felt about it.
To me, it read a lot like when Americans see America acting Americanly. They say we're acting like North Korea or China or Africa or the Middle East, going back to American exceptionalism. We are supposed to be exceptional, not like these shithole countries. So even that line, even in the way they were trying to admit that they can be reactionary, was still a very reactionary take. But Lake, what are your overall thoughts about part one?
I mean, I think it was a lot of setup, a lot of introduction. I mean, I think it did a good enough job at that. You know, it was trying to compare the homeless camps, the sanctuary, to the rich and fabulous of Jadzia that Jadzia was experiencing. And I think they didn't really hammer home the decadence so much on Jadzia's end, just that, oh, it's better. I don't think they captured how exaggerated it is this episode, but they build on that later. But all in all, you know, it was a pretty solid episode. It gave us a good framing for what's going to happen next.
Scott, how did you rate this episode?
So I give it a 4 out of 5 mythology. But like, just like a regular 4.
4 minus.
Yeah, it's like a 4 minus. Like I find that this couplet of episodes is really important in the mythology of the show and why Deep Space Nine has had a lasting appeal and part of why people have been revisiting Deep Space Nine. I feel Deep Space Nine has really had the biggest of people to get to it afterwards by all the shows. You know, if that happens with Voyager or Enterprise, I'll be very surprised. But there's generations and generations of young people that love this show, and part of it is for episodes and couplets like this where they're doing different things. And so I give it a 4 for effort, but it wasn't necessarily as good as I remembered it. But I did remember when I realized that, you know, this was this season and that we were going to do it together. I was like, yeah, it's going to be crazy. And then I watched the episode. I was like, oh, memory is an interesting thing.
That's the reason why I brought up Lennon, because I think for this episode, early on, for a lot of baby leftists, they were like, oh shit, this episode is so radical, right? Oh my God, this guy's like Lennon. But now at this point, it's like, that's being awfully generous, right? So
yeah, it's more like McCartney or George Harrison or something, right?
So this is the end of part 1 of Past Tense. If you haven't seen part 2 and want to watch it before you hear us break it down, pause it now. Otherwise, Scott, tell us about part 2.
All right. The city workers are being held hostage. Ben is being smart, using his understanding of tactics and being a commander. He has them move away from windows and barricade things and try to avoid snipers or things of that nature. The cops and the social worker and the other people, they don't want to die. Bashir worries that part of the Bell riots is that Bell dies, and since Cisco is pretending to be Bell, he's going to die. And the riots are sort of being televised, but Jadzia just feels that she has to go there. The Defiant is trying to find out where to go. The B team energizes to the Roaring 20s, and they're like, oops. The Ghosts, the ones who have not integrated well, have selfish demands, and Bell and his people, they want jobs, and the district closed. Sorry, not Bell. Cisco, going as Bell, wants his friend Michael Webb to make some demands, but the video is cut off. Mr. Webb speaks to the police. The police ask to see the hostages. They see them. One of the hostages is hypoglycemic. And so Bashir tends to her, and she's like, she's kind of like a social worker. And she says that she let people disappear into the sanctuary before, but she sort of just keeps her head down and does her job. She knows that this isn't right, but also just doesn't know what to do. The older cop hostage tries to escape, creating another standoff, but Ben continues to keep the peace. And the old cop fails to feel sympathy or empathy, and it's just sort of like, you could do better. It's your fault, And then Kira and Miles show up in the 60s, where some like San Francisco hippies give them some flowers. They didn't go to a Grateful Dead concert. The cops and the cops and the negotiations are not going well. They're not going to end the sanctuary. That just like they're offering bad offers, they're declined. So then, Jadzia is, she sneaks into the sanctuary district through the sewers. But, before that, her friends were talking about the Neotrots. Cisco is trying to figure out how to broadcast the situation, that maybe the masses seeing the unrest will change hearts and minds. Jadzia shows up. Bashir and Jadzia go to find her comm badge, because her comm badge is like taken from a guy played by Clint Howard, Ron Howard's brother, who's like just like a mainstay sci-fi actor. Jadzia goes back to Brenner, hoping that he will risk his TV status by showing what is really happening. So they start recording everybody's story. The governor decides that the SWAT's going to go in. Kira and Miles finally beam to 2024 because they're running out of time. It's obvious that something is afoot, and the SWAT's going to come. Michael Webb kisses his son goodbye. The SWAT come. They kill Michael and they kill some others. Ben is shot, but he survives. The security cop guys decide to let them go, and they're going to tell them that they died and that they died heroes. And the old cop finally understands, I guess. And, Cisco was Bell. Cisco did the thing. The timeline is restored, except they find a historical database that shows that Cisco is Bell. And Bashir posits how things could get so bad.
If you love the Southpaw Project, become one of our financial supporters. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. We can't exist without your contributions. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at southpawpod.com. Now, the second part was about humanizing everyone, and that everyone is just victims and cogs in a system. I think Ira Bear literally said it's about their conditions. Like with BC, he said he's not a murderer. It's that the conditions made him murder. Or the cops, they can't act as individuals. Just fascist symptoms of a fascist system. Like, how can you have good cops when you have concentration camps anyway? The problem is top down. You see this when the governor calls for the killing of the protesters, but he needs to do that because of pressure from above, from the law and order country that has sanctuary districts throughout the whole country. The whole country is post 9/11 USA Patriot Act and then some. So there's a lot of Marxist thinking in this episode. Initial thoughts about the episode?
I mean, I did appreciate that sort of materialist angle of like, these are the conditions that push people into this situation. It's not necessarily about individuals, being remarkable. It's just that these are the conditions that they're in, and this is what they're pushed towards.
Yeah. So the idea that what is going to change is that by people seeing the atrocities will change the hearts and minds, and therefore power will be changed. Goes a little bit different than, say like Trotsky saying that only under its own revolutionary direction is the proletariat of the colonies and the semi-colonies capable of achieving invincible collaboration with the proletariat. You know what I mean? Like, that's not
just off the top of your head.
That's how again, I think you're saying earlier that people getting back into the show and like the baby lefties being like, oh yeah, this is so there and blah, blah, blah. Yes. And it's a little naive to think that these things would happen this way. But I still think it was a great episode.
Well, let's get into that then, what you just talked about. Because in this episode, they talk about student protests in France and the neo-Trotskyists putting it down. I know when I mentioned it on Facebook, some people who don't know DS9 got offended because there are currently protests in France right now.
To be fair, when are there not protests in France?
That's true. Did you two think that scene was a diss on communism, where it's like that reactionary critique that communists become the new oppressors, like the whole Animal Farm mythology, which I have to mention, that book was being written during World War II. Did you know that? Orwell was writing it during World War II because he hated that the USSR was being celebrated for fighting the Nazis. So while Jewish people were getting genocided, he's like, okay, well, the real problem here is the Russians. Okay. So to give that context to that book and where that mythology came from, is that what this episode is doing with that scene, that little small scene that didn't even seem like it belonged? Or do you see this more as a diss on a certain strain of Trotskyism, a certain strain of actually neo-Trotskyism that believed the greatest obstacle to socialism wasn't capitalism and the US, but rather the USSR and communism? So, and this has happened, there have been Trotskyists who were willing to work with the West and capitalists to stop communism, which student protests are always accused of being as communist uprisings.
Yeah. I think it's I think there's so many ways you can read into it. And I wish I could have listened in on the writer's room or talked with whoever was the one to slip that in, because I think that would change the context a lot. Because it almost felt like they just picked a random left sect to slip in there. It didn't matter. They're like, what sounds lefty? Neo-Trotsky. Trotsky's a socialist, right? Neo-Trotsky is there. They're neo-Trots. And it almost felt like they were trying to say, yeah, neither left nor right, just humanity coming together and, working together to create the Federation, sort of utopianist kind of ideal. Maybe there was a writer. I mean, there are so many subtle socialist hints in the show that maybe a writer really was trying to dig on Trots, which I wouldn't I wouldn't necessarily put it past someone to do that.
Okay, so I have a lot of thoughts and I'm really glad to do them. So, I don't know how political the writer's room is from time to time. I really can't tell. A lot of the writers seem just like regular writers who thought they were really smart. And I'm sure a lot of them are. I mean, then again, we were talking earlier, like one of my favorite Next Generation movie is First Contact. And one of the main characters, James Cromwell, who plays Zephram Cochrane, who's like pretty awesome leftist dude. But do I know that the writer's room realized that Star Trek, they're doing a space communism? Do they know that?
No.
Right. But to me, the Federation of Planets is space communism. There, for the most part, because there is still status and need of money and black markets and interesting things going on. But for the most part, the idea is that there's no need for money and everyone works for the greater good. And everyone has access. So to me, that's a space communism. So it's funny to do a show about a space communism and utopian space communism too. And interesting as when we look at shows about the future, that this show is one of the more utopian. And I think that's because of it realizing to disengage from the capitalist idea, because science fiction movies and books where capitalism is part of it, it's just much darker. And I've said this many times, watch Babylon 5. It's Deep Space Nine, but capitalism. It's dark as fuck. Anyways, I think that they were just throwing some names into it to be clever. But at the same time, I wouldn't call myself a Trotskyist now, but like Fourth International and the writing of C.L.R. James was very central to my awakening to the left. So I was just I brought out my dog-eared version of Leon Trotsky on Black nationalism and self-determination, which it's been rumored was actually written by C.L.R. James, but I could find no proof that that's actually true, which is something I've heard before. So I say take it all with a grain of salt. I just know that they worked with each other, obviously. So that's how I feel about all that. But yeah, I just think they're trying to say even on a show that's all about space communism, they're going to try to throw, communism under the bus by saying, "Oh, the neo-Trotskyites, they're doing bad."
Because just from a linguistic perspective, neo-Trotskyist does sound more futuristic and like esoteric.
I really think they just picked a random socialist name out of a hat and slapped neo on the front.
And that might not have even known there actually was a strain called neo-Trotskyism too.
Yeah.
What did you two think of the lighter story with Kira and O'Brien traveling through time, and also the impossible task of trying to find people lost in time?
I mean, I have a soft spot for O'Brien. I love any scene that man is in. And even in the beginning, he was just like, "Oh, I'm not going to that fancy dinner. That's why I'm an enlisted man." And I just loved that classic O'Brien zinger right at the front. Yeah, I mean, I think it was enough to give us kind of breathing room in between the more intense stuff between Dax and Captain Dad and the riots. And I'm sure they also just had some sets on hand for the 20s and for the 60s that they just wanted to use because they were hanging around, maybe. And yeah, I just think it was a nice break. I love it. I don't feel like we see enough of O'Brien and Kira together, and I feel like those two characters have a lot of affinity for one another, just being kind of more working class radical type characters. So it's always good just to have them in a scene together.
I like having the two people I'd most want to have a drink with getting together.
Yeah.
What's interesting is O'Brien, Cole Meany, I think this is one of his favorite couplet episodes, which is interesting to me because it's an episode where he's barely in, or he's like a very minor character in this, that he's not central to the plot at all. And there's been so many other episodes where he's the main character, yet this is his favorite story. So
I think those other episodes are just, how can we torture O'Brien? And this episode was, he gets to play dress up with the Na'vi visitor and just have a grand old time. So I think it would have been a fun episode to film.
He's like, "Oh, in this episode, I'm not the one getting beat up and thrown to the ground and having to cover myself in oil and dirt. It's going to be somebody else. I just play dress up. Cool." Now, according to Bear, past tense was meant to be a wake-up call to viewers to say, this is the future we're headed to unless we change something. And something both of you have alluded to is how the solution was that a big protest would change hearts and minds. And once that happens, U.S. oppression ends. And if we thought that before all the protests during Trump and the pandemic and lack of healthcare or national lockdown and all those people across the world dying because of capitalist hoarding and going back to business. And also the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests, Stop Asian Hate, pro-abortion protests, and trans right protests. If you thought maybe it was about changing hearts and minds before all that, how can you still think that now, knowing what we know?
It's absolute. I'm gonna, if I can curse, it's absolute fucking hogwash because people just don't care, and they don't see what they want to see. Because if you see what's going on with the disenfranchised, with our LGBTQ comrades, and police brutality, and you see it, it's you can find it. You don't need the news. It's on the internet. It's on YouTube. It's on TikTok that they're trying to get rid of. It's there, and you see it. And in fact, some people, it's emboldened them. They like it. They see that shit and they're like, yes, because it's largely unacceptable to be outwardly racist, but it's very acceptable to be outwardly transphobic, and it's the new gateway drug to Nazism. I will say it because you are celebrated in certain cultures if you say transphobic stuff, and it's disgusting, and it no one's hearts and minds are changed. It's not. So there's direct action is important. So yeah, just seeing, because there's videos of the tent cities, there's videos of what's going on in LA and San Francisco, Portland, not Maine, sorry, of what's going on in the unhoused. And I can tell you, I don't want to say where I work, but I can just say that I interact with a lot of homeless people, and there are these homeless encampments, and they're hard to hide. And you see what people are going through, and people are just like, get a job. And it's dumb because something like 70% of the unhoused work. It's that the cost of living is so high. The cost of healthcare is so high. The cost of finding a place is so high. You say, oh, well, you can just find a room downtown for $500 a month. Well, what if you're making $600 a month? You know what I mean? So the whole changing hearts and minds, it's a liberal, and it's something the liberals or centrist Democrats and Republicans think can really happen, because it doesn't. It's no. No, it's okay. I'm very angry in the past couple of weeks with what I just see happening in this country, particularly to our trans comrades. Just shows me the cowardice that a lot of this country is. I said it. I don't care.
With everything that's happened in the last several years, right? Hearts and minds didn't change.
No.
To your point, a lot of people got emboldened, and in many ways, we're more nationalist and reactionary than before the protests, even amongst the so-called liberal crowd. So saying it'll be about hearts and minds is where the story is no longer Marxist, because everything is caused by the conditions, even according to Ira Bear. But then at the end, to change the system, rather than changing the conditions, you're just saying, just change the hearts and minds.
One of the things that struck me is that the fancy rich person party that Dax was at, when they mentioned the sanctuary districts, one woman went, oh, do they still have those? And obviously that was meant to represent sort of the ignorance. But then the other guy actually said, oh, something along the lines of like, oh, I mean, they have to have those, what else are we going to do with those deplorables? And just this idea, like, yeah, he had full knowledge that these things existed. It just wasn't polite to talk about them because they're a necessary thing to get rid of the rabble. And that kind of set the tone pretty early on for this idea that, oh, if you just let people know how bad it is, they'll want to fix it, which, as Scott was just saying, just runs completely counter to every bit of history we have for ourselves. And a lot of this felt like they were kind of drawing on what happened with Martin Luther King. You know, this pacifist, great leader who protected people was martyred, and then we changed things with the Civil Rights Act, completely ignoring, you know, the massive upheavals, the massive riots and protests, and the fact that the Civil Rights Act was basically just a pacification measure to buy off the population to avoid this violence, not just a response to Martin Luther King getting martyred and everyone deciding that racism was bad.
And also the thing is, it's for many people, it's a loose idea because a lot of people's assumption of what racism is so limited. So they think like racism is like outwardly doing something racist. And most people would say that's bad. Most people don't identify themselves as racist. However, a lot of people don't realize that there are lots of things that are racist that aren't just like not saying bad words.
Then we had the two cops say they're going to whistleblow. And the assumption is that's also going to change everything. But that's not how whistleblowers are treated in this country. They're always persecuted, dismissed, and the things they try to bring up and bring to light are often never heard about widely, or it's regarded as conspiracy.
Or they just turn up dead.
Yes. Now, what did you two think of the two cop characters turned whistleblowers? They had their hearts and minds changed, as well as just from having kindness shown to them, right? You just need to be kind to them and they'll change their hearts and minds.
I mean, in the beginning, I actually liked how they were framing the cop characters, because one was, you know, the outwardly derogatory, aggressive, mean cop, and the other one just wanted to get home to his family. He was just doing his job, but he was still letting the quote unquote shitty cop do shitty things. So I liked that framing of the bad cop, good cop almost, but both of them were just as complicit. But then, yeah, they were treated like humans, and they saw that these people were struggling, and so they were gonna help them out and save them. Which, that totally that totally helps. That totally works.
That's how it works, right?
Yeah,
totally.
Guys, we figured it out. We solved it.
That's it. Oh my God, it was right there. I don't know why we didn't think about that. Now, according to the writers, most fans at the time liked these episodes, but critics did not. Some critics said it was too liberal. And according to some of the writers, they got constant complaints about these episodes for years, that they only showed the liberal side and not the other side, which explains to me why they have to be so restrained and centrist with this show, because even this milquetoast series of episodes was too radical for people. But what the fuck is this other side the critics wanted shown? Are they talking about what Lake mentioned with the fancy fascists at the parties? Like, what else are we going to do with it? Like, are we supposed to hear more of his side? What do you two think they meant?
I mean, I think I agree with them. I think the episode is too liberal, but I think
same, but in the wrong way.
Yeah. I'm trying to think maybe just more time on the cops. Yeah, it needed to be an episode about those two cops and all the terrible things they go through oppressing poor houseless and black folks. And then we see why that cop got so hard and mean is because he got his feelings hurt oppressing people.
Or what about the feelings of the fancy homeowners? Maybe that's what they wanted to address here.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a time where critics were more, critics are of all types of political leanings. I mean, even Joan Didion's like fairly not left, still pretty good critic when she was able to not let that get in the way. But you could argue, how could you ever not let it get in the way? But I don't know. I think TV criticism probably tended to veer a little right in the 90s, maybe.
And I think they also meant a certain segment of the fans kept sending them letters complaining about these episodes. Like, asking them to do another set of episodes showing the other side. And yeah, maybe it was some homeowners association sending these letters. I don't know.
I mean, there's always right-wing Star Trek fans. I don't understand how that is, but it is a thing. But their media comprehension leaves something to be desired.
I think Jeff Bezos is a right-wing Star Trek fan, and I think like Elon Musk and stuff. So there you go. The fancy fascists are real and sending complaints, and liberal writers see that this doesn't change hearts and minds, right? They're seeing from these critics, hey, it didn't change their hearts and minds. But see, this doesn't even change liberal writers' minds about how changing hearts and minds doesn't work. Regardless of what happens, regardless of what they're told, their hearts and minds aren't being changed. They're like, no, it must work still. And nobody can tell me otherwise.
We just didn't frame it properly. If we say just the right words, it'll be good.
And Lake, you were talking about Michael Webb being very liberal. And even milquetoast liberal Michael Webb gets shot because he was too radical.
Yeah. So
what did you think about that? That the guy who was like, let's all just figure this out and get along, dies.
I mean, I could find you so many examples in American history where even the most modest requests for change and improvement will get you shot and get you killed.
JFK.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part is just spot on. You know, even the gentle, soft guy who almost did things right. He was going to do the peaceful protest. He was going to get everybody to work together. Even he ended up in the same box as, you know, the more radical ones.
I don't know, man.
Lake, what do you think about past tense's predictions of our now? Are we in the dystopia?
I think we're a bit past the dystopia at this point. So there's this kind of dystopia dichotomy people talk about of 1984 versus A Brave New World. And it's the idea that we expect dystopia to be big screens and giant cameras and jackbooted thugs on the street. But dystopia actually is oftentimes a lot more subtle. And I think we kind of see that with the camps, you know, with the sanctuary districts. There are walls, there are cops with shotguns everywhere and keeping them penned in. When in reality, it's not that people are forced into these places by gunpoint. It's just that any other option is taken away. And that's why we end up with these homeless camps under the interstate, is because every other possible option is systematically removed. And so while it doesn't appear as violent or it doesn't appear as striking, it's oftentimes worse and more insidious. And I think that's the trap this episode fell into, is they think it's going to be more overt and obvious than it is.
Scott and I talk about that a lot, the fascism of accounting and paperwork. And I think Scott has a term, like, what did you call it? Like procedural fascism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A lot of oppression happens in language and writing, and way before, like, it's chess. So many moves have happened before you even realize it. And you know, I reference, you know, this nonviolent stuff will get you killed by Charles E. Cobb a lot. So the whole oh, you know, Martin Luther King, just be nonviolent. Like, no, all of it gets you killed, and none of it's going to get done through kumbaya. And I don't know.
Yeah. And the way bureaucracy is weaponized, like why would they kill you or get rid of you when they can just make you go away through inaction or through these sort of more obtuse barriers? My partner was a social worker for a while, and they worked with refugees coming to Maine. And like just the stuff I heard and how hard it was for people to navigate the social system. Like the wait list for affordable housing in Maine is 7 years long, and the application is about 200 pages thick. And they refuse to translate the application outside of English. So if you are not a native English speaker, you have to coordinate a translator, a social worker, and someone to write for you in order just to get the application in. And even during all of that, you're not allowed to work. You're not allowed to pursue any other, like, you're not even allowed to set up a GoFundMe to try to raise funds. You are just completely dependent on this purposefully slow, sluggish state. And, oh, they found you a laundry voucher so you can go get laundry done at the laundromat, but it's 2 miles away and you don't have a car. You can't buy a car. And their social worker isn't allowed to give you a ride. So you have to schlep your baby and your basket of laundry 2 miles back and forth every week just to have clean clothes. It's the layers of bureaucracy that can just make it so inconvenient for people to survive is somehow more effective to them than just straight up getting rid of people.
Because it allows for plausible deniability.
Yeah.
It's something Professor, who's a friend of the show, Nadia Kim, has talked about, whereas neglect as fascism.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of the misstep that this episode takes in its dystopia, is it assumes things are going to be more overt than they are.
Yeah, which is why, in a lot of ways, being taught Orwell in school actually makes us more reactionary rather than makes us more aware of what reactionary looks like, because it's preparing us for something that isn't going to be the way that we think it is. And then it also it gives us the wrong assumptions and guidelines. And maybe somebody said we need to read less Orwell in school and more Marx, but they're not going to even have you read Marx at all.
Can we just make this a George Orwell hate podcast? Because I'd be down for that.
I have no problem. I have no problem with that.
You look into the guy, he's a sexual abuser, colonial cop.
A snitch and a bitch.
Yeah. He's a racist, purposely snitched to the intelligence community. The Black liberationists complained that Black liberationists were too anti-white and were racist against white people. The people who are willing to die on a hill for Orwell, that's a red flag, big red flag, or maybe it's not even a red flag. Maybe that's just a receipt. It's not even like, oh, there's something up. It's just like, no, that's a bad person. But how close is this portrayal to ICE and concentration camps for immigrants and our reactionary immigration policies?
Yeah, I mean, even both ICE and the prison and jail system that can just hold, like, one of the scariest things I think we saw with this episode is that they were launched into this bureaucracy where they were just going to get lost. And there was no real sign of, oh, is it going to be months before they got a job? Years? And I think that's the most intimidating part we're seeing of our legal system, whether it's for protesters, whether it's for immigrants who are going to be locked up with no chance for trial, no chance to speak for themselves, or at best be thrown into a mass trial where they get 5 minutes to defend themselves. And just the parallels between those two things of just getting lost in the bureaucracy and using these wait lists to punish and detain people without actually legally accusing them of anything is one of the more intimidating parts of the episode that just runs so parallel to what's happening right now.
To connect to your previous point, this DS9 shows the kangaroo courts of Cardassia as like the pinnacle of fascism, right? And it's like, no, the real pinnacle of fascism is the system where we have now, where at least they're getting some kind of trial. Like, they're not lost in the system, right? Whereas here, especially since the USA Patriot Act, you could just detain people, not charge them indefinitely. And since that time, you have people lost in the system who end up going from juvenile detention to life in prison because they got lost in the system. You have people who die of starvation, or they're neglected and forgotten about, and they kill themselves because they're just locked up in county jail for something minor, but they can just forget about them and leave them there. And they're allowed to do that because of the laws that have passed, because of the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act at least had a name that tried to trick people into thinking, oh, okay, Patriot Act, that sounds neat, right? That doesn't sound necessarily bad. I mean, it wouldn't sound good to me because patriotism is fascism, but for some Americans, or a lot of Americans, I could see how that happens. But we're having U.S. Patriot Act 2.0 with the Restrict Act and the Data Act. And this time they're not even giving you a tricky name like Patriot Act. They're literally calling it the Restrict Act. They're telling you what it is. And people are like, yay, that sounds great, right? So how many rights are we going to lose because of that, right? So a lot of this, the real pinnacle, the real awful fascism is that fascism of being lost, of neglect, where they don't even have to give you a 5-minute trial. They're not even going to bother using money, right, in this capitalist system to do a kangaroo court for you because that costs money, that costs manpower. You're like so worthless, you don't even deserve a kangaroo trial.
I think there's a worthy comment to be made about the reserve army of labor here too, because they talk about constantly how there's not enough jobs, how there's no roles for these people to fill, and I think we're starting to get into that now, which is another scary parallel. But I think that's part of the reason that they didn't just straight up find a way to get rid of all these people in sanctuaries, because maybe they would need this reserve army of labor to fill these roles and service the economy. And having these disenfranchised, desperate people, armies of these people on hand, is literally the definition of the reserve army of labor. So if there ever was a need to break worker power or a need to increase production, then they could start just throwing jobs at these people. And they're so desperate and in such a precarious situation, they would withstand all sorts of abuse in order to get out and get these jobs.
You could just turn the camps into private prisons and enslave them and then make them work for you, right?
Yeah.
And going back to your overt fascism example, right? People think gulags are the pinnacle of fascism when it's like, no, dude, we got private prisons here, man.
Yeah.
You want a private company in charge of you? And also, how are these private prisons making money, right? It's just enslavement. So
we're rebuilding the company town.
The US is literally making a company world.
Yeah.
Lake, overall thoughts about part 1 and 2?
I mean, I kind of agree with Scott's comments earlier in that I think this situates the message and the themes of Deep Space Nine really well. I kind of feel like we didn't get any character growth from anybody. I mean, we know that Captain Dad is ready to sacrifice himself for a good cause and that he's a nerd for U.S. history. We know that Dr. Twink is a little naive and really good for some background commentary and questions. And we know that Dax will just effortlessly glide through whatever situation you put her in. And I think that was disappointing, not getting to see character growth. But, and you know, we didn't get much modern world expansion for Star Trek, but the history, the going into Earth's past episodes are always very poignant, and they kind of set the commentary and social tone of the episode, of the series, really well.
Actually, the actor who plays Bashir said this episode was important for his character because his character grew in that. He didn't say this, but basically to summarize, he went from this kind of sex pest, not only a sex pest, but like just a bad person in a lot of the previous episodes, to, hey, I can help people. I can be serious. I could be grown up. And look, I'm trying to be helpful. I'm trying to be a good guy. And I think that was important for him, which makes sense for him. He probably didn't like the character of Bashir that he was playing previously, but now he's like, okay, I like this character.
I didn't realize this episode was that pivot, but I'm eternally grateful for the pivot away from Dr. Horny.
I think it's a good pivot, and also like a fun little like Easter egg is, you know, yeah, Cisco, big fan of baseball. He mentions Buck Buckeye in the episode as a way to be like, I know what's going on in Buck Buckeye. He's about to be, you know, it's the only thing that the team has. It's a minor character in the lore.
Scott, how do you rate part 2 and how do you compare it to part 1?
I will give it a 4.5.
Whoa.
Yeah, because of potential. Because I think a lot of people watch these episodes and are like, get excited about politics. So I give it a 4.5. Even though, yeah, there's not a lot of character development and there's a lot of disappointing shit, but I think it's important. I think it's significant in the canon of Deep Space Nine. I think it's really part of the wave of episodes of where season 3 becomes like, oh, this is a good show. We're still not totally there to where it's like, oh, banger, banger, banger. You know, there's still some monster of the week joints, but this just like, give me more stuff like this. I can work with it.
Lake, thank you for being on the show. If people are interested in following the Revolutionaries Garden, where can they find it?
So you can follow Revolutionaries Garden on Facebook or find us wherever you find podcasts at the Revolutionaries Garden. We have a website, revgarden.com. I don't update it much, but there's all of our stuff on there. And I think we have a Twitter. I should probably use that, although maybe not. Twitter's a sinking ship.
Yeah. It's too late.
Yeah. So Facebook for now. Facebook and wherever podcasts can be found.
And are you on Instagram?
I should be.
Lake is really dropping the ball on his social media here.
Yeah. I'm an old man. All I got's the Facebook.
Scott, can you tell us about the next episode?
The next episode is called Life Support, and a vet gets sick. Until then.
If you like this episode and like what we do, support us on Patreon. We also have the Liberation Martial Arts program if you want to train with us from wherever you are. It's both theory and practice and removes the need for an instructor. What you're learning is how to teach yourself. It's also an approach you can take with you from the gym into the world. Sponsors get a monthly training session with me, either in person or online. Supporting me not only helps me pay my bills, but it also helps me support my family. Find all our links, including Southpaw merch, at southpawpod.com.